Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into Nelson Mandela's monumental autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom.
And this is so much more than the life story of one person, isn't it? For us, it serves as a detailed, an insider's guide to the architecture of systemic oppression.
Exactly. It's a blueprint of how a racist state engineered total control from the economy right down to a person's individual dignity.
That structural analysis is precisely our mission today. The core question we're using this text to explore is critical and, well, chillingly relevant. How does a state build a system of structural oppression, in this case apartheid, that is so rigid, so legally and economically enforced, that resistance itself is immediately and perpetually defined as a crime?
And then the other side of that coin. How do those trapped within that perfectly engineered system develop the collective resilience,
Yeah.
the strategic adaptations they need to dismantle that reality?
Right. It's a study in systemic control and the counter systems of resistance that have to emerge to fight back. And this matters now because understanding the mechanisms of apartheid, a system designed explicitly to manage power, labor, and perception based purely on race, it offers profound insight into how institutionalized bias operates globally.
Absolutely. We need to look past the specific history of South Africa and see the underlying patterns of control, patterns that persist long after specific discriminatory laws have been abolished elsewhere.
So, just to be clear for everyone listening, we're not here to offer political judgment on individuals.
No, not at all. We are here to trace the mechanical levers that the state pulled. We're focusing on the legal and economic structures that didn't just suggest behavior, but literally compelled it.
They shaped outcomes for millions of people.
hmm
And we'll be tracing Mandela's evolution from really a beneficiary of one traditional system to a revolutionary fighting a modern racist one.
We need to see analytically how the machine of oppression was built, how it functioned, and why it ultimately failed.
Okay, so let's unpack this with some necessary context on the author and the book itself, because Mandela's starting point dictated so much of his eventual struggle.
It really did.
Nelson Mandela wasn't born destined to be a lawyer or a global icon. He was born into the Thembu royal household, a descendant of the Exeba house.
And that distinction, Exeba, is highly relevant. It's not just a detail. He was groomed specifically to counsel the rulers, to be a chief's advisor, a minister, not to actually rule himself.
So his whole upbringing was steeped in this traditional system of authority.
Deeply. He grew up embedded in it, learning the history and the rules and the customs of the Xhosa people. He was, in a sense, a traditionalist.
But the very first defining experience of his life, even as a toddler, showed him the immediate, forceful conflict between that Thembu custom and the overriding power of the white colonial system.
That's right. His father, Gadle Henry Mfakandiswa, who was a respected counselor and acting chief at Mvezo, was summarily deposed. Just gone.
And why? What was the infraction?
He defied a white magistrate's summons. And you have to understand, this wasn't just him being rude or stubborn. It was a principled, traditional assertion of his own authority.
He was drawing a line in the sand.
He was. When the magistrate demanded he appear, his father sent back this legendary defiant reply in Ekosos, Andizi, Indisakwa.
Which means?
Roughly, I will not come. I am still girding for battle. He was essentially saying, you have no legitimate power over me in these traditional matters. He was questioning the entire systemic override of white authority.
And how did that system respond to being questioned?
Instantly and brutally. There was no inquiry, no debate, no hearing, just immediate deposition. He was stripped of his chieftainship and all the income that came with it.
And that had a direct impact on Mandela's childhood.
A profound one. This sudden loss of status and means forced Mandela's mother to move the family to the desperately poor rural village of Kwanu. So, from the very beginning, the colonial system demonstrated its absolute power. It showed that traditional authority, no matter how respected, just went. It crumbled instantly when it conflicted with white law.
And then his education started to dramatically expand his world beyond that provincial perspective.
Right. He attended mission schools like Clarkbury, and then he went to Fort Hare, which was the intellectual hub, really the Oxford and Cambridge, for Black Africans and future leaders all across Southern Africa.
And Clarkbury in particular seems to have been a key turning point for his identity.
It was a huge step in his evolution. He realized there that his distinguished Thembu lineage, his aristocratic bearing, It meant absolutely nothing to his boarding master or to his peers who came from other groups.
So a classic meritocracy lesson.
Exactly. He was compelled to recognize that his success would depend on his ability, on his merit, not on his heritage. And this is, I think, the first major step in him shedding that sort of ex-hosa-first traditionalism he admitted he started with.
And that personal shift paved the way for the critical political shift later on.
Absolutely. He started as an ex-hosa first traditionalist, genuinely believing that to be Thembu was the most important identity, but to be politically effective, he had to recognize himself as an African first.
A necessary step for unity.
A critical ideological step.
Right.
It was the only way to forge political unity against a system that was consciously, actively trying to divide them ethnically into smaller, more manageable subgroups.
And the book itself covers a massive historical and cultural span.
It does. It moves from that localized rural stability of Kranu in the 1920s all the way to the rapid formal escalation of apartheid laws, especially after the Nationalist Party came to power in 1948.
And that's when you see the introduction of this devastating legislation.
Yes, the Group Areas Act, the Suppression of Communism Act, and the truly insidious Bantu Education Act. All of them designed specifically to manage power, labor, and crucially, perception.
And that evolution in state control is mirrored exactly by the evolution of African politics.
Perfectly. Mandela details this shift away from the older generation's non-militant approach,
Yeah.
what he called the Dr. Zuma era.
Which relied on what? Polite letters?
Light formal delegations,
Dink.
deputations, meticulously written letters of protest to the white government, which were, of course, systematically ignored.
And that polite approach was replaced by the radical demands for immediate action from the ANC Youth League, which Mandela helped found.
Right. They demanded mass action, non-cooperation, the defiance campaign, and then eventually the strategic necessity of armed resistance through Umkhonto Wizwe, or MK. They realized the state was simply not listening to polite letters.
So when you look at the entirety of this context, the central thesis of Long Walk to Freedom really emerges. It's not just a story, it's a political manifesto.
It is. And it states simply that freedom is indivisible.
And that the path to achieving that freedom transforms individuals in fundamental ways.
Yes. It compelled a highly successful, law-abiding attorney like Mandela, a man who deeply valued the rule of law, to become an outlaw.
And how did he describe that process?
He called it a steady accumulation of 1,000 slights, 1,000 indignities, a slow, grinding process that made remaining law-abiding simply impossible if you wanted to retain your humanity.
And finally, the book makes it clear that liberation demanded collective action and strategic adaptation.
And that includes the calculated, phased use of force when nonviolence proved utterly ineffective against a state that used violence institutionally.
And a collective resilience.
A collective resilience to preserve human dignity against a system designed entirely for systematic dehumanization. That's the stage. Now we can really dig into the mechanics of this oppression.
Okay, let's move into the core ideas. Let's look at the actual mechanisms the state employed, and you argue we should start with the economy.
We have to. Because the foundation of apartheid was not primarily ideology, I don't think. It was pure structural profit.
So this is our first major insight. The design of economic exploitation was achieved via the systemic disruption of traditional African life.
Exactly. The profitability of the entire engine of South Africa, the gold mining complex on the Witwatersrand, depended almost entirely on one thing.
And that was air?
Cheap labor in the form of thousands of Africans working long hours for little pay with no rights. It's a direct quote, and it's the core of the entire economic system.
So, to guarantee this endless supply of cheap labor, the government had to structurally enforce a system of forced migrant labor.
Yes, and you have to ask why. Why not just have workers live near the mines? Because they couldn't have large, stable African communities near the mines.
Why not?
Because stable communities develop resources, they develop political organization. And eventually, they demand higher wages and better rights. The system required instability to function.
So the system was deliberately designed to create instability.
Precisely. And Mandela's own description of his home, Kwanu, is the ultimate illustration of this economic mechanism in action.
How so?
He says Kwanu was a village of women and children. Why? Because almost every able-bodied man was forced away for the greater part of the year, working in those distant mines or on remote, white-owned farms along the reef.
So you have entire communities hollowed out.
Think about the systemic cost here. The economic system maintained massive white prosperity by structurally requiring and facilitating the dismantling of African family and community stability.
The gold mines needed the men.
And the rural villages paid the social cost. Fractured families, economic dependence, stunted development. He describes how the men were only allowed to return briefly, mainly just long enough to plow the fields before the rainy season.
Leaving the rest of the work.
The hoeing, the weeding, the harvesting, all of it left entirely to the women and children. It was a perfectly designed system of extraction, both of labor and of community strength.
And where did these migrant workers live when they were at the mines?
They were housed in segregated single-sex industrial compounds. They were essentially barracks. There was no personal freedom, no ability to build a family life, and absolutely no mechanism for collective bargaining.
Which was critical for this system.
It was. It ensured the labor supply remained cheap, disposable, and easily controlled by the state and, of course, the mine owners who profited from it.
So that intentional forced internal displacement brings us to the next point. This was all managed by the legal system.
The legal system as a machine for criminalization. Yes. This is what Mandela realizes as soon as he arrives in Johannesburg as a young man. He sees that his entire existence is, in his words, circumscribed by racist laws and regulations that cripple his growth, dim his potential, and stunt his life.
And his conclusion from that, as a law student and then a lawyer, was pretty profound.
It was. He concluded that simply to be an African in South Africa meant being politicized from the moment of one's birth. You had no choice.
Why? Because the law made everyday life an exercise in criminality.
Exactly. The law was pervasive, not localized. It was a crime to walk through a whites-only door. It was a crime to use a whites-only drinking fountain. It was a crime to be in the city after a certain hour.
But the most powerful mechanism of control was the passbook.
The pass laws were the bureaucratic choke point of the entire system. Mandela says it was a crime not to have a passbook and a crime to have the wrong signature in that book.
Can you explain just how devastating that one bureaucratic requirement was in the everyday life of an African man?
It was constant visceral terror. The passbook was basically a labor passport. It determined where you could live, where you could work, and for whom you could work.
And it had to be signed by your employer.
Which is the key. That meant if you quit your job or were fired, you immediately became an illegal resident in the urban area, and you were subject to immediate arrest and deportation.
So it completely suppressed labor mobility and protest.
It ensured absolute loyalty to employers, even the most abusive ones, and the penalties were designed to perpetuate this system.
How so? Being arrested for a pass law violation wasn't a long prison sentence, was it?
No, it was usually a minor fine. But here's the trap. For a man earning almost nothing in the compounds, that fine was impossible to pay.
And what happened then?
Then you had a debt to the state, and the system created this mass population perpetually living in a state of outlawry by government decree. The fine meant debt, and that debt meant you were compelled to return to the labor system, often working for the state or for white farmers just to pay it off.
It's essentially institutionalized forced labor.
It is. The sheer volume of these petty restrictions meant the police state had total control and could arrest anyone for anything at any time. It created a mass underclass that was constantly justifiably fearful of a justice system designed solely to oppress them.
This systematic criminalization then leads directly to our third major insight. The system of resistance had to evolve strategically to even have a chance.
It had to. The formation of the ANC Youth League, which Mandela helped lead, marked the definitive rejection of that older system of polite, ineffective pleading with the establishment.
They weren't writing letters anymore.
No, they were demanding mass action, non-cooperation, visible defiance. And the key realization here was strategic.
Meaning?
For Mandela, who studied Gandhi extensively, nonviolence was not an inviolable principle. He was very clear about this. He saw it as a strategic tactic.
A tool to be used.
A tool to be used for as long as it was effective, meaning for as long as it compelled the state to negotiate or change its policies.
But of course it stopped being effective.
It stopped being effective very quickly. When the ANC, through campaigns like the Defiance Campaign in the early 50s, where activists would deliberately break unjust laws like curfews or entering white-only facilities, when they demanded the repeal of these laws, they were met with absolute, uncompromising dismissals. Prime Minister Milan just refused to even engage.
So the state meant nonviolent mass action, not just with arrests,
but with institutional violence and new, even harsher laws. Things like the Public Safety Act, which allows for the declaration of states of emergency, and the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which imposed heavier penalties for nonviolent resistance.
So it was a feedback loop. The more they protested nonviolently, the more tools the state created to crush nonviolent protest.
Exactly. It demonstrated that nonviolence had lost its strategic utility, and that failure point was brutally, horribly crystallized in 1960 at Sharpeville.
A nonviolent protest against the past laws.
And the police opened fire, killing 69 people, most of them shot in the back as they tried to flee.
And the government's response to that massacre was not reform.
The response was immediate and overwhelming repression. They declared a state of emergency, they banned the ANC and the PACER. They detained thousands of people without trial. This was the definitive signal that the system would meet any peaceful dissent with lethal violence.
So the strategic calculus changed overnight.
It had to. The ANC leadership concluded that maintaining moral purity through nonviolence was tactically suicidal, and that led directly to the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe MK, the Spear of the Nation.
But their initial choice of action was very calculated. It wasn't terrorism.
No, it was sabotage. And this was a measured and deliberate use of force. It was initially targeted only against symbols of oppression and infrastructure, power plants, post offices, transportation links, specifically to avoid the indiscriminate killing of human beings.
So it was a systemic necessity.
It was forced by the regime's brutality, not a moral lapse. They reasoned that if the state uses violence to enforce its will, the resistance must respond with violence to undermine the state's infrastructure and demonstrate its own resolve. There was no other path left open.
Moving on, we come to a really fascinating insight. Education as a field of systemic conflict. Mandela calls it intellectual bus gap.
Yes, and the state understood this perfectly. To maintain a system of inferiority, you have to control what the majority population learns, and more importantly, how they perceive themselves.
And the Bantu Education Act of 1953 was the legal mechanism for this.
It was. Boskap translates literally as mastery or bossship, and in this context, it meant intellectual control and the institutionalization of inferiority.
So what did the act do specifically?
It transferred control of African education from church bodies, which often provided a relatively liberal instruction, directly under the hated Native Affairs Department, which was headed by the chief architect of apartheid, H.F. Verwoerd.
And Verwoerd was very open about his goal for African education, wasn't he? It wasn't just about poor funding.
No, it was about limiting ambition. He famously stated, what was the point of educating African children for green pastures that were not open to them? His system was designed to ensure that African people received only enough education to become efficient laborers.
Manual workers, servants.
Exactly, and absolutely nothing that fostered critical thought, political awareness, or any aspiration to equality. It was education for servitude.
But the resistance adapted again, even in the most hermetically sealed environment imaginable, prison.
This is one of the most incredible parts of this story. The internal organization within the prison system directly challenged this institutionalized ignorance by establishing what they defiantly called the University of Robben Island.
A magnificent act of intellectual autonomy.
It was. The prisoners, especially the ANC leadership, who were highly educated, turned their cells into classrooms. They taught official academic courses, languages, history, law to one another. But crucially, they also taught political courses.
Like what?
Walter Sisulu taught a detailed course on the history and ideology of the ANC. They were preserving their own history, their own political theory, against a state that wanted to erase it.
How did they even manage that under constant surveillance?
It was a complex internal system. They established a high organ, or high command, which coordinated everything. Lessons were written on tiny scraps of paper or inside the margins of permitted books, and then smuggled between cells during labor details or yard time.
So it was an active intellectual rebellion.
It was done explicitly to maintain intellectual autonomy and ensure the younger generation of prisoners understood the long history and the political vision of the struggle. They were actively combating the state's effort to erase their history and their capacity for critical thought.
Which leads us to our final core idea, the system of imprisonment as systemic dehumanization. Robben Island was more than just a jail.
It was designed to be a purely authoritarian state. Its entire purpose was to rob prisoners of their identity, their individuality, and most importantly, their collective dignity.
And the dehumanization was meticulous. It was systemic.
Entirely rooted in racial classification. African prisoners were subjected to the absolute harshest treatment, the most meager diet, segregated and inferior facilities, and the mandatory abusive use of the term boss by the warders when addressing them.
Constantly reminding them of their presumed inferiority.
Every single interaction was designed to reinforce the hierarchy. But the prisoners' response wasn't individual capitulation. It was collective organization.
The high organ again?
Yes. It coordinated collective struggles for what seemed like minor things on the surface, but were actually deeply political acts.
Like what? What kind of things were they fighting for?
Fighting for sunglasses to protect their eyes from the blinding glare in the limestone quarry. Fighting for the right to wear long trousers instead of the dehumanizing short pants that were meant for boys. Struggling to get equalized food portions between racial groups.
So these weren't just about comfort.
Yes. Not at all. Mandela saw these victories as corollaries to the struggle we waged outside prison. They understood that preserving collective humanity and challenging the system's rules, no matter how small, was fundamental to maintaining political resistance itself. It was a fight for dignity on a daily basis.
That deep dive into the core ideas gives us the mechanics of apartheid. So now, let's use the source material to explicitly map this system. Let's analyze the actors, the drivers, the narratives, and the self-reinforcing loops that allowed it to persist for so long.
Absolutely. When you map the actors and hierarchies, you see these really clear layers. At the very top of the oppressors, you have the visible political actors, the Nationalist Party government and its ideological core.
And below them, the enforcement arms?
Exactly. The police, especially the notorious Special Branch, and the prison warders. But we can't forget who was fundamentally financing the whole system, the powerful economic beneficiaries.
The white-owned mining houses, they're the critical, often invisible actors here.
Their immense wealth, derived from that cheap labor system we talked about, it fueled the entire legal apparatus. It gave the government the political mandate to enforce segregation. Without the profit from the mines, the system's economic incentive completely collapses.
Okay, so on the side of the oppressed and resistors, you have the visible leadership, the ANC, MK, and their crucial allies.
Right, the Indian and colored allies who participated in multiracial campaigns like the Congress of the People that drafted the Freedom Charter. But the true base of the movement was the African masses, both the urban population in the townships like Soweto and the rural populations in places like Kwanu.
And there's one more layer we have to scrutinize because it ties the whole system together, the boundary enforcers.
These were the local magistrates, the civil servants, the district officials responsible for administering the passed laws and the district restrictions. They were the bureaucratic cogs in the machine.
And they didn't need to be passionate white supremacists to do their jobs.
Not at all. Their job was purely administrative. Enforce the rules that kept the migrant labor system functioning smoothly. Impose the fines, sign the passes, regulate the movement of black labor. The daily function of apartheid was carried out by these non-ideological bureaucrats just doing their jobs.
And that ensured the economic engine kept running and that Africans were kept in a state of controlled movement and debt.
Precisely.
So if we look at the fundamental incentives and drivers, they align perfectly with those actors.
They do. For the state, the incentives were a deadly combination. Massive financial gain through cheat controlled labor, the ideological imperative of racial preservation, which was codified through Grand Apartheid and the Bantustans, and of course the political stability that was maintained through the brutal legal suppression of any dissent.
And for the resistance, the incentives were simple but existential.
Completely. The quest for dignity, for self-determination, for freedom, and the ultimate establishment of a truly democratic, non-racial government based on merit, not on birth or skin color. It was a fight for recognition as full human beings.
Let's talk about the core narratives, because these were essential for shaping behavior and justifying violence on both sides.
The state's narrative was simple, and it was constantly repeated. White supremacy is necessary and natural. Any opposition is therefore treason, or worse, a foreign-backed communist plot.
And that narrative served a very crucial function.
It legitimized everything. It legitimized police brutality, state violence, the wholesale removal of rights. All of it was framed as simply maintaining law and order against internal traitors or external agitators. If you can label the ANC as communist, then you can ignore their legitimate racial grievances and frame it as a national security issue.
And the resistance narrative, conversely, was expansive and inclusive.
It was centered on the foundational document of the struggle, the Freedom Charter, which famously stated, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white." The struggle had to be African-led, yes, but multiracial where appropriate.
And crucially, they pushed a counter-narrative of suffering.
Yes. Imprisonment was not a disgrace or a source of shame, but a badge of honor, a sign of your commitment to the cause. And that narrative shift fundamentally disarmed the state's correctional system. It turned their punishment into a symbol of pride.
So systems persist because of feedback loops. We see two dominant loops that allowed apartheid to maintain its rigidity and inertia for so long.
The first one is what we can call a control loop. The state passes a repressive law, say, banning certain organizations or implementing the 90-day detention law. This leads to African resistance mobilizing in response, like with the Defiance Campaign,
And the state then responds
with greater violence and new, more pervasive laws. It reinforces the system of control through more legalism. Every attempt at nonviolent legal change simply gave the state new justification and new tools for legal oppression. The very act of asking for change resulted in a harder, more oppressive system.
the second loop is the violent response loop.
Right. Nonviolent mass action fails because the state applies institutionalized, lethal violence against it, Sharpeville being the clearest example. The resistance then strategically concludes that nonviolence is impractical and shifts to calculated sabotage or armed struggle with MK.
And, of course, the state immediately uses that calculated violence to justify its own narrative.
They pounce on it. They use it to justify their narrative of treason and to enact further repression, claiming they were simply defending civilization against terrorists. This cycle shows how the system ensures its own inertia. It leverages both blatant, immediate violence and the slow, grinding power of bureaucratic infrastructure. And it persisted because the economic and political incentives for the white minority were just so deeply entrenched in the legal framework.
Moving from the past to the present, let's consider what the architecture of the system teaches us about contemporary society. The structures Mandela describes give us a precise lens to view modern systems of exclusion, even when the underlying ideology is no longer explicitly racial.
A really powerful lesson is the persistence of narrative control. The apartheid government relentlessly, for decades, tried to brand the ANC as communist-controlled, despite their primary, obvious goal being African nationalism and self-determination.
And they use this label to isolate the movement.
Isolated internationally, and most importantly, to avoid addressing the legitimate, deep-seated structural and racial grievances at home. It was a deflection tactic.
That is a pattern we absolutely must learn to recognize today. We need to analyze how modern political systems use specific, loaded labels, be it foreign influence, extremism, radicalism, whatever the smear is, to shift public discourse away from legitimate structural complaints.
Exactly. If a population is complaining about systemic economic inequality or institutional bias, the power structure can effectively neutralize those complaints by framing the complainants as radical, as security risks, or as ideologically compromised.
It's a mechanism to shift the argument.
It shifts the argument from a structural problem that demands reform and resource allocation to a security or ideological problem that demands suppression and policing. It's deflection by defining the source of the complaint as illegitimate.
We also see the functional legacy of apartheid in what we can identify as systems of internal displacement.
Yeah. The forced migrant labor system and the pass laws, they created and enforced massive segregated townships like Soweto. At the same time, they were draining rural villages like Kwanu of their entire working-age population. This was residential and spatial segregation designed solely to manage labor flows for the white economy.
So when we look at contemporary governance, we need to examine how seemingly neutral bureaucratic processes can achieve very similar outcomes.
Exactly. Do modern housing policies, zoning regulations, or municipal planning, for instance, indirectly create economic ghettos by concentrating poverty and limiting access to opportunity?
You can see it in transit systems. Do they enforce spatial inequality by making it impossibly difficult or expensive for low-income workers to commute to high-opportunity areas? Or you can think about the historical use of slum clearance as a justification to remove the thriving mixed-race community of Sophiatown.
The language was neutral, slum clearance, but the result was the forced removal of non-white residents to segregated, planned townships far from the city center.
This shows us that power can become hidden inside these seemingly neutral bureaucratic processes.
The mechanism is no longer the pass law, but maybe it's convoluted zoning ordinances or inaccessible mortgage structures. They functionally perpetuate the legacy of residential and labor segregation, even when explicitly racist laws are off the books.
Our third implication touches on the high political and personal cost of transformation, the ethical dilemma of strategic compromise.
This is a tough one. Mandela, the ultimate symbol of resistance, the man labeled a terrorist by the state, made the decision in the late 1980s to pursue secret talks with government figures like Kobe Coetzee and later F.W. de Klerk from prison.
And not only did he talk to his jailers, he made immense strategic concessions.
He did, including publicly accepting the need to reassure the white minority by repeatedly stating, "We do not want to drive you into the sea." He had to compromise on rhetoric and on timing in order to achieve a transfer of power that avoided total bloodshed.
So this was a necessity, not a desire.
It was an agonizing strategic compromise. He accepted incremental progress and huge personal risk in order to achieve systemic change without plunging the country into a total civil war, which would have destroyed the very system he was hoping to inherit.
And this raises a powerful question for our own lives, doesn't it? Whether we're involved in major political movements or just smaller organizational change.
It does. Does the pursuit of profound moral or political objectives require us to engage with, and sometimes compromise with, systems or actors we fundamentally despise?
Do you engage in the dialogue with the power structure to gain long-term leverage? Or do you maintain moral purity at the cost of political paralysis and continued suffering?
Mandela chose strategic engagement, and the book shows the immense risk he undertook to do so.
Let's broaden our perspective one last time and situate Mandela's experience within some larger universal themes of social transformation. This book is just a masterclass in systems thinking and human resilience.
A key theme that cuts across the entire narrative is this tension between systems versus individual blame and transformation. The book demonstrates that lasting change really accelerated only when the system began to shift, not just the people operating within it.
You see this in Mandela's description of the warders on Robben Island over the decades.
It's a profound observation. They started as cruel, rigid ideologues, but he notes that their attitudes softened considerably over time, especially as the outside world began to change.
And he identified a specific reason for that shift.
He did. He specifically noted the shift when warders saw prominent and educated white women discussing serious matters with a black man on the basis of perfect equality during visits.
So that visibility of equality undermined their assumptions.
It undermined their deeply held systemic apartheid assumptions that Africans were inherently inferior or childlike. When the external environment changed, the rigid individual belief structures of the warders began to crack. It proves that changing the environment allows for individual change, but not necessarily the other way around.
And this connects directly to the power of moral narratives that are embedded in institutions.
Absolutely. The state uses its correctional and legal systems to impose shame and stigma. We discussed how the Defiance Campaign's strategic success came from removing that stigma entirely, by turning a prison sentence into a badge of honor.
So by collectively embracing the punishment, they disarmed it.
They removed the power of the state's intended sanction. They flipped the narrative of the correctional system on its head, converting an institution of control and shame into a proving ground for commitment and dignity. That is a foundational mechanism for resistance, preserving your own humanity despite institutional efforts to rob you of it.
And finally, the overarching principle that drove every single action. From the smallest demand for food equality in prison to the largest strategic negotiations with the clerk.
The indivisibility of freedom.
That was his ultimate realization.
Refined through decades of struggle, yes. He says, freedom is indivisible. The chains on any one of my people were the chains on all of them. The system, because it was fundamentally flawed and designed for oppression, had to be dismantled entirely.
No reforms would be enough.
No. Partial freedoms or localized improvements, like getting slightly better food in prison or a few concessions in a township, those were only temporary mitigations of a fundamentally rotten structure. You cannot fix a machine that is designed to oppress. You must replace it with a system designed for equality from the ground up.
This deep dive into Nelson Mandela's long walk to freedom offers such a profound and meticulous systems analysis of oppression. It really helps us see the subtle and the overt mechanics of control with chilling clarity.
It does. It shows us that structural control is maintained not just through overt violence, but through meticulously crafted, legalized bureaucracy and deeply embedded economic mechanisms. The pass laws, the zoning, the educational control that are often far more insidious than simple brute cruelty.
The greatest power of apartheid was its ability to make the oppression seem normal.
Routine, legal, just the way things are.
And Mandela's decades-long journey demonstrates that dismantling such a system requires rigorous intellectual preparation.
The student and lawyer meticulously studying the law,
Physical discipline,
the boxer and the prisoner maintaining fitness and mental resilience.
and above all, a strategic willingness to adapt resistance methods, from petition to mass action to armed struggle, as dictated by the specific violent response of the political system itself.
And why this perspective matters today is simple. By analyzing the complex and often mundane bureaucratic mechanisms of the past, the magistrate's desk, the signature in a passbook, the type of meals served to one race versus another, we become far better equipped to spot power hidden inside neutral processes.
And to recognize modern manifestations of systems designed to manage exclusion, whether that is in governance, economics, technology, or social policy.
The knowledge serves as a critical alarm bell that oppression can wear a suit and carry a legal statute.
But looking at the entirety of his life raises one final agonizing question for us to consider. Mandela had to sacrifice his personal life entirely. He became a man without a home, separated from his children, sacrificing the role of husband and father, all for the liberation of his people.
It's a haunting reality. So, given the structural demands of profound revolutionary systemic change and the dedication required to dismantle these powerful mechanisms, are those who dedicate themselves to fighting harmful systems today, always destined to make similar, agonizing personal sacrifices.
Or can a free and engaged society structure itself to sustain its fighters without demanding such a high personal cost?
It's a reflection on the impossible choice between private life and public destiny that system disruption so often forces upon its leaders.
That is a question we must all carry forward.
Our source material for this analysis was Nelson Mandela's essential autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author if you find the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.